Cool, right, I think we'll get started. We're about there time-wise, so, well, it's nice to see you all. Thank you for coming to this talk today. Before I get going with all of this, I just want to get a quick feel for who I've got in the room. So who's here, who's heard of Blazor? Like, that would be a bit cool. Marketing are doing well, that's important. And who's using Blazor actually for building real apps, work and stuff? Yeah, cool, good stuff. So who's heard of Tailwind? Few of you, okay? Anyone using Tailwind? Okay, cool. I'll come to you if there's any problems then. Excellent, okay, cool. So we've got the right type of people in the room, that's the important thing. So this talk is very much aimed at people who are using Blazor, they understand Blazor at whatever level that is, but you're interested in Tailwind, what Tailwind can do for you, and more importantly, how these two technologies can work together to build beautiful apps. Now, that's beautiful is obviously in the eye of the beholder. I'm an enthusiastic amateur when it comes to design, okay? So let's not set that bar too high for the moment. But this talk is very much going to be more focused on the actual, like say, the technology thing. How can you do things like animations we're going to look at, dark mode, and just really get a feel for how Tailwind is to use and develop and all that kind of thing. So before I get into everything, this is a little bit about me. So I'm a principal software engineer at a startup in the UK called Deployed. We use Blazor and we use Tailwind, okay? So we've been doing that for the last couple of years. So built up some experience using it and found it to be a very productive way of styling our apps. We don't have an in-house designer, we used to. Now we don't anymore, and we just use Tailwind and the design system that we put together. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I also do some blogging, or I used to do some blogging, because then I decided to write a book, because that seems like a good idea when you start that. 2 years later, the book is now finished, but I'm slightly off writing, so I'm just doing lots of talks instead. Yeah. So if you are interested, Blazor in Action is actually just gone live, like for buying and stuff. So if you are interested in that, then that's available on Amazon and Manning.com. And then the final string bow is that I do open source work. So I maintain Blazor libraries. If you've done any work with Blazor, you might have come across them. So I have things like local storage libraries and modals and toasts and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, you didn't come here to hear about me. You came here to hear about Tailwind. So let's start right at the beginning here, okay? Let's start with the basics. What is Tailwind CSS? Well, Tailwind CSS is what's known as a utility-based CSS framework. So what do I mean by utility-based framework? Well, utility-based frameworks are all about atomic style classes. They're very, very focused, okay? Usually only affecting one CSS property. And what you do is you add these all together and compose them to create a look. Now, the nice thing about this is you almost never get two sites that look the same, which is good. So if we compare that with a popular alternative like Bootstrap, right? That's what I would call a component-based CSS framework. So in a component-based CSS framework, usually it involves going to getbootstrap.com, clicking on the docs link, and going, I want a modal. So you click on modal, and then you get a whole raft of options. You get a chunk of markup, which you copy and paste, and then you get that look. And if you want a slightly adaptive version, you usually scroll down the page a bit more and you find the version that's got buttons or that has a hidden header or whatever it happens to be. But the point is you're just using this pre-baked stuff. Now, the downside here is that everything tends to look the same. There was a joke for a while that everything on the internet was made with Bootstrap because every site ended up looking identical. But the component way of designing is very useful. It's very good if you've got no design experience because you have these pre-made things that all look good together. You have things like buttons, you have toasts, you have modals, you have all that stuff that's ready to go. But if you do want a bit more customization, you then hit a wall very quickly. If you try and customize Bootstrap, it's not an enjoyable experience. First of all, you need to put in a build system like LAS for doing less or SAS or whatever they're using currently. You need to get all their files, you need to modify them if you want to do that, and you can create your own custom build of Bootstrap. Or you do the other approach, which is leave Bootstrap as it is and then create your own CSS file that overrides a whole load of their stuff, and then you have to maintain all of that. So that can be a bit of a pain. Tailwind, it's a bit of a different story. Tailwind's been designed from the get-go to be customizable. Tailwind's very useful if you do have a design team because you can actually take all of your company's design language and actually encode it into Tailwind. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second. So let's actually look at a real-world example of Tailwind. So I was talking about card components from Bootstrap. So this is actually a card component from Bootstrap. So this is taken from their docs. That is the markup that you need, and that will produce that card you see on the left-hand side of the slide. Pretty straightforward. But what would this look like if we wanted to do it with Tailwind CSS? Well, this is exactly the same card that has the same look, but now we're using Tailwind's utility classes to style it instead. Okay? So if we just have a quick look at these, we'll work through this as an example so we can all be kind of at the same level. So at the top there on that outer div, we've got some classes there. We've got flex and flex col. So that's saying we're going to use flexbox for the layout of the child elements. And in this case, we want the child elements to be stacked as a column. So that's what flex col does. You can just about make it out, I think, on... No, not really. So take my word for it. There's a very, very light shadow around that card component. That's what shadow LG does. Rounded T, rounded top, that's because at the top of that card, that image has very slight rounded corners, so it's rounding at the top. There's also things like round left, round right, bottom, whatever. H40, so that's the height of that image. Now, 40 isn't actually a specific number in terms of rems or pixels or ems or anything like that. It actually maps to a value in the design system, and we'll talk about that design system in a second. P4, padding 4, that goes all the way around. And again, the number's based on a design system. Text gray 800, again, that's the text color, but it's based on a color value in a design system. Text LG, font semi-bold, margin bottom 2, you're starting to get the feel for what this looks like now. And text base, in fact, that one doesn't even really need to be there because it would inherit text base by default. I just got a bit overzealous at that point. But the point is, the nice thing about Tailwind, and one of the things that I've found and my team has found with using it, is that it makes us more productive because we can see what our styling is just from our markup. When you're doing styling with frameworks like Bootstrap or Bulma or Foundation or any of those types of ones, you end up having to have a style file over here and then your markup file over here, and you're jumping between the two, and you're going to write a class and then apply it, and then maybe you need to do a modifier. You might need to do a hover effect or something, so you have to go back, you write another class, and you come back again. So you're constantly jumping between CSS and markup, okay? But you don't do that with Tailwind. It's always markup. It's just applying these classes. And you can see here, once you get used to the naming conventions, it's very easy to read what's going on at a glance. Now, I mentioned design system several times. So Tailwind is, in fact, just one big design system, okay? And this is important. Design systems are good. Design systems offer us constraint. They stop things getting messy, okay? A good example of this is where a company I previously worked at, we use Bootstrap like a lot of people do. And by the way, I don't hate Bootstrap. It's a very good framework and everything. But one of the problems we suffered was the application was quite old. It had been developed over a number of years. And what we tried to do when we wanted to do a rebrand was go through and clean up the CSS. Well, this CSS file was nearing 3,000 lines by this point. So this wasn't a particularly pleasant experience. It got even worse when we realized that we had actually styled the same thing several times with several different classes that should have all been one class and used multiple times. So we then had to dissect that out of that style file. But we also noticed inconsistencies. Someone put padding as 8, someone put padding as 10, someone put padding as 6. And across pages and things, you can't really spot these little differences as such until you start getting to two things that are side by side. And they look a bit off and you can't work out why. And that kind of arbitrary values is what causes that problem. Tailwind can solve this by putting some more constraint on that. You can use these numbers from this design system and it can make things more consistent. Now, because it is a design system, it does need to be compiled, okay? So with version 2 of Tailwind, it used to come with like a pre-built version that you used at development time with a load of kind of sensible defaults, if you like. And then you could turn other bits of the system on. Now, this is quite an important thing because if you actually turned all of the options on for Tailwind CSS, you got a 20 meg CSS file come out the other side. Now, if you try and do anything in DevTools with a 20 meg CSS file loaded, you'll notice that browsers do not like that, no matter how much RAM you have. So you get a real slowdown. It's really awkward to work with. They solved this problem in v3 by introducing something called the JIT compiler. Now, this is quite cool because what happens with the JIT compiler is you can set it up and it watches the files that you're adding your Tailwind classes to, and it dynamically generates you a CSS file as you use those various utility classes. And this is good. It means that when you're actually building in development time, you're using effectively exactly the same CSS file as you would have at production, okay? And you get to use all the features of Tailwind arbitrarily. So if you just want to use something that involves dark mode, you add some dark mode styles in, and it just automatically works. Okay, so that's quite an important feature and quite a big change in version 3. Now, for some people, this is now the bad news. It is NPM based. Okay, now for .NET developers, this can sometimes be a bit of a sort of cringe point. Personally, I don't mind NPM, but there are some people who are adamantly against it for reasons. Fair enough. But it is still the best way to use Tailwind. So I'm going to demonstrate a way that you can do that today using a slightly newer version of NPM. There's a command called npx, which is a little bit easier to use than NPM. And we'll talk about that. But for anybody who absolutely does not want to touch that, well, Tailwind have brought out a new standalone CLI as part of their v3 release. So this is available from their GitHub page. You can go on their releases tab, and you can download an executable for macOS, Linux, and Windows, and it's just standalone. It doesn't rely on Node or NPM or anything like that. So what can we actually configure in this design system? Well, the first thing we've got here is color palette. So Tailwind ships with a really good color palette to start off with, and it's quite a good color palette is an important point when you're designing apps. So there's 22 colors available for you out of the box, and they all have a range like this. They range from a value of 50 up to 900, 50 being the lightest, 900 being the darkest. But you can customize all of this, and we'll talk about that in a sec. Now, these colors get used in various utility classes. So, for example, if we want to do text like we saw earlier, we just do text hyphen, then the name of the color and what sort of shade, if you like, we want of that. But we can also use it for things like background. So you can do BG gray or BG purple or whatever you want it to be. Spacing. Hopefully that just about comes out. You might struggle at the back. But basically, there's a sliding scale here for sizing. So this is a way that you can be a bit more constrained. Like I said, instead of people putting arbitrary 8 pixels, 9 pixels, 10 pixel values, you can use these numbers in this design system. And it's a proportionate design system. So it basically 8 is double 4. Okay, so it becomes quite easy to kind of get a feel for how much spacing you want or not wanting and to be able to manipulate it. So that's used for things like padding, width, height, margins, anything you could think with, that would be sort of space related. Now, another really cool feature of Tailwind is something called variants. Now, this is really just like pseudo classes in CSS, but this is things like hover effects, odd even effects on table rows, all this kind of stuff. This is all possible with Tailwind, and it's you apply these modifiers to the utility classes, and we'll see this in action in a bit when we look at some demos. But here's a couple of examples. So, a good example is a button. I want it to be a background red 500 by default, but when you hover over it, I want the background to be red 800. And then there's a modifier here as well, a variant for dark mode. So this is saying for this div at the bottom, the background's going to be white by default, but if dark mode is active, then it's going to be BG gray 800. Okay. So as I said, this stuff is all configurable. There's something called a tailwind config.json file. So it's just basically a JavaScript object. And inside of here, we can do all kinds of things. So in this example here, I'm replacing the default color palette. So I've gone in the theme object, I've shown colors, and I've replaced what's there by default with the colors that I wanted. I can also extend it. So I could wrap the colors object in an extend object, and that would extend the existing colors. So I can build on top of it, I can replace it, I can do whatever I want with it. That's the important thing. So another way that we can think about Tailwind is essentially it's just Lego blocks for UI design, okay? You take all these very small focus pieces, compose them together to create a look, and if you don't like a particular part of that look, like the color or the the margins or the padding, whatever it happens to be, you just make those small tweaks, swap out those little blocks, and you can very quickly customize. So really where Tailwind came from, in fact, is it originally really started off as a really rapid prototyping framework. So you could build out UIs very, very quickly because you weren't jumping between files. You weren't actually writing any CSS as such, which is kind of an interesting sort of thought when you're using a CSS framework, that you don't actually write CSS. In fact, what you'll see in a minute is we're going to go into some demos in a little while, and I'm not going to write any CSS for the rest of this talk. Everything I'm going to do is going to just be using and manipulating utility classes. So let's possibly address a bit of an elephant in the room for anyone who's sort of been around in 90s programming and early 2000s and inline styles. Often people new to Tailwind start to have a bit of a reaction around this time, which is like, well, this just looks like inline styles in a different form, and inline styles are evil. We shouldn't be using those. What are you saying, Chris? This is terrible. Fair play. That's an understandable opinion. I can get that. So let's just look at the limitations of inline styles and why they're kind of not something that we should generally be using. Well, first of all, inline styles are magic numbers. They're just values that we hard code into our markup. And say I put some padding and a background color or something like that using a style attribute. If I want that anywhere else, I basically just copy and paste it somewhere else. And then if I want to change one of those values, all of a sudden I decide that the background color needs to be a different color. I've got to go through all of my app and find every place where that's been hard-coded and I need to change it. So that's a real pain, but with Tailwind's design system, that's not really true of Tailwind, okay? We've seen there's abstractions in place, okay? And we can change configuration centrally in that design system, recompile it, and actually we can have values and be changed behind the scenes and not have to always do that in markup. Pseudo-states, so things like hover and focus, they can't be used with inline styles. Inline styles just don't support them, okay? So if you want to do even the most basic UI effect, like a hover effect on a button, that's not going to work, okay? But we can do all these things. We've already talked about this. We can do this stuff with Tailwind. And finally, media queries are not supported in inline styles. So if you've got any kind of need to make your website look good on mobile devices and tablets and desktops, well, if you're going to use inline styles, there's nothing's going to help you there. But again, this is all possible. We can do all this stuff with Tailwind, okay? And that's because Tailwind is still CSS classes. They're just very focused classes, okay? Now, there are some other bits about this, and we'll talk about those once we get into the demos. So we'll loop back on some of the limitation stuff. But for now, let's start tying this in with Blazor. How would you actually start to bring Tailwind into your Blazor application? Well, option one is something called the Tailwind Play CDN. So this is a new CDN they brought out for version 3 of Tailwind. So this is pretty cool because, like I said to you earlier, Tailwind needs to be compiled. So how does that work with the CDN? That seems a bit odd. Well, the old CDN used to work how you probably would guess. It was the pre-compiled sort of defaults that V2 had, and you just had those and you just had to make do with them. And if you want to do any customization, well, you're out of luck. You've just got to do everything locally and what have you. But V3 is a lot different. So for V3, we actually add in a script tag to some JavaScript, okay? And then once we've done that, all we have to do is put one tag in, and we can just start writing those utility classes out, and everything just works. And the reason it just works is because there's a little JavaScript library there running, and it monitors your DOM, and it looks for the usage of these classes. And what it does is it dynamically creates a style tag in the head element, and it just adds the styles in as you use them. Okay, so similar to what the JIT compiler does with an actual CSS file when you're doing local development. Now, what's cool about this is you can still customize it. You can do pretty much all of the same customization with the Play CDN that you could do as if you were doing development locally. So to do that, you just create another script tag after the first one, and then you just create that config object, and you just start configuring it as you would do locally. So you can pretty much change anything you want. And it gets even better as well. So after that, you can also use plugins. So Tailwind has a pretty rich plugin ecosystem. There's a few sort of official plugins that they have available, and then there's a whole heap of community ones. With the Play CDN, it's only the official ones that are supported, which kind of makes sense. But in order to use any of them, you just stick a query string on the end of that first script tag, and you just list out comma-separated the plugins you want to use. So in this case, the typography and the forms plugin, okay? And they just get included as well. So this new Play CDN is a really powerful tool for getting sort of used to Tailwind, understanding it, deciding if you like it with real minimal investment from you. There is, of course, a trade-off here. Unfortunately, the Play CDN is not supported for production use. So if you're thinking that you could just use this and not have to worry about all of the other bits, for your app, unfortunately not. You can't use this for production scenarios. I don't think they can necessarily enforce that in any way, but I'm guessing that the infrastructure they have is probably not particularly guaranteed, so use at your own risk. So what happens if you actually want to use Tailwind seriously, if you want to put it into your application? Well, that's where the Tailwind CLI comes in. Okay, so this is what we talked about earlier. So this is the NPM-based CLI. We're going to actually now use this in order to work on the app through the demos. I'm choosing this one because, firstly, I do think it's the better option. If you've got any existing JavaScript code, which I find most people I speak to have something, then you've probably got some kind of pipeline anyway. So this hooks into that really easily. And the other problem with the standalone one is you also have to deal with getting a standalone executable into your CI pipeline if you're doing that kind of thing, which can be a bit of a pain. So this just kind of integrates a lot better, in my opinion. So with that, let's actually move past PowerPoint and actually have a look at some code. So let me just swap over to Visual Studio. And we'll want to duplicate that. So that will come through. Yay. See that at the back? Yeah, cool. Lovely. So what we've got here is a standalone Blazor WebAssembly application, but it's not the regular standalone Blazor WebAssembly application. I've been working with Blazor for what is weirdly coming up for like 4 odd years, which might sound a really long time because it sounds like it's all really new, but it's been around since about 2017 in a kind of experimental state. So I don't know about anyone else, but I'm getting pretty bored of that template with the purple gradient down the side and what have you. So I thought for this talk it'd be fun to reimagine the getting started template using Tailwind and see if we can come up with something more interesting. So if we look here, you can see that this is the index page, but it's got Tailwind classes in it now. And I've stripped out all of the Bootstrap stuff. Okay, we've got rid of the CSS files and all that kind of stuff. All that's left to actually do here is set up Tailwind itself. Okay, so I've not done that, so we can work through that together. So I wanted to do this to show you how sort of quickly you can get up and running with that. The caveat here is I have got Node.js installed. Okay, so that's the only kind of thing I've done ahead of time that you would have to do normally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by jumping over to my terminal. I'm going to run this command initially. This is just in the root of that project, okay, which is that npx command I was talking about earlier. So npx Tailwind CSS init. Now, before I go any further, just to quickly kind of share the difference between npm and npx for those who are unaware. npm is the thing that creates the node modules folder. npx doesn't do that. That's basically the takeaway here, all right? npx works slightly differently. What it does, it uses a central kind of cache of npm packages on your machine, and it doesn't litter your project with them. So what would happen if I ran this on a brand new machine? Well, what would happen is npx would reach out or check the local cache, see if I've got the Tailwind CSS CLI there, if I have that package. If I don't, it will go out to the npm repository, download it, and then execute it. So I don't have to worry about a package JSON file or anything like that. So it's just a much more streamlined way of running an npm package. So we run that, and then after a second, it's going to have generated our Tailwind config.js file. So that's our config file. So if we come back over, we can see this is what it looks like by default. So there's not a lot in here. It doesn't need a lot. We used to have to turn stuff on at this point for extra features, but like I said, with the JIT compiler, we don't need to do that anymore. The only thing we actually have to do at this point is we have to put something into this content array. Now, this content array is used by the JIT compiler to basically monitor files for usage of these utility classes. So what we need to do here is tell the JIT compiler where are the files that are going to use Tailwind classes. So we can put in this value, which is basically just recursively searching my project and looking for any file with a razor or an HTML extension, okay? And then it's just going to watch those files for usages, and it's going to just regenerate my CSS file every single time. So that's that bit set up. Next thing we need to do is I need to add a new folder here. I'm going to call it styles, and inside of here, I'm going to add a new CSS file. So let's come down here. So we'll call this app CSS. And inside of here, I'm going to put these 3 Tailwind directives. Now, if you've used Tailwind before, this will look a little bit familiar. So what happened in V2 was that when you kind of ran Tailwind, this would generate like however many thousands of lines of CSS, which was the default styles. And then that was kind of it. And then you would have to regenerate every time you changed any settings. Similar kind of thing happens here, but not so many. It can generate those 1,000, but only if your app is actually going to use it. Excuse me. So that's all we need to do. So at this point, we've got an input CSS file and we've got a configuration file. Okay. So to get all this running, I'm going to jump back over to my command line and I say npx, I'm going to say Tailwind CSS, and then I'm going to say input file is going to be that styles app CSS that we just created. I'm going to say I want you to output the built version to my www root folder css app.css file. Now at the end, I'm also going to add this switch called --watch. Okay, and that's what is going to tell the JIT compiler to keep watching for changes based on what I put in that content array. All right, so you can kind of think of this as a bit like a hot reload-ish kind of thing, but for Tailwind. So we'll get that going. So that's now scanned all of the files in my project, and then it's produced a output CSS file. Okay, 144 milliseconds. It's pretty rapid. So if we go and have a look at that, this is the file that it's generated. So you can see here at the start, it's got a load of basic stuff for any framework really, which is CSS reset stuff. But as you get down further, you can start to see these utility classes appearing. And that's because they're already there in my app. Okay, I've already put a load of styles in because it would be painful to watch me type out loads and loads of styles here on the stage. So this has picked up what's already there and we're good to go. So I can now just come in my host page and I'll just add a link in to that generated CSS file. And at that point, we're good to go. We've now got our app up and running. So let's go and have a look what our application looks like. So this is it. This is a getting started template, but it's using Tailwind now rather than Bootstrap. Now, admittedly, it's not looking that impressive at the moment, okay? And there's good reason for that. But you can see some initial styling on the header and things, but this text doesn't look too great, and that looks quite boring and weird, so we'll probably need to do something about those. So let's start off with that text on the left. So that hello world is actually an H1 tag, so that should be quite bold and in our face because that's a header. And the bit underneath welcome to your new app is a paragraph tag, so that should sort of be certainly spaced out, if nothing else, from the header. So let's have a look at how we just do sort of that more kind of what I would call the kind of setup styling, if you like, for this kind of stuff. So if I come over to my H1 tag here, you can see I've got nothing in this class. There's no styling here initially. So I'm going to put some stuff in. I'm going to say I want the font to be extra bold, like so. I'm going to want the text to be pretty big. So we'll say text should be 7XL. So that's going to be pretty big. Just for a bit of spacing as well, I'm going to say I want tracking to be wide. And the last one I'm going to say is margin bottom 6. So if I save that and come back over here, excellent, that's good news. You'll find this, I've done this talk 5 times in 6 weeks, and it's a roll of the dice whether Hot Reload wants to play nice that day. Today does not look like that day, so this could be interesting. Anyway, as you can see, the styles now come through. So we've got this hello world now looking far more like a header than it was. So the next thing is this P tag. So the P tag, that just wants to be a little bit bigger. So I'm going to say I want the text to be extra large. And then I want a big margin on the bottom of this one. So I'm going to say margin bottom 20. Aha, worked this time. Cool. And now it's gone through. I'm glad it's worked this time because now I can say, and you can see that .NET's hot reload system works with Tailwind CSS. Tailwind CSS hot reload is very, very good. .NET's not so much. It's getting there. Okay, it's doing some very complex stuff, but there's definitely some bugs to still iron out at the moment. But when it works, it's a very, very slick development process, okay? I'm talking through that as I'm doing it, but you can imagine I can just be tapping away, save, boom, and I've got my couple of elements styled out. So that's just some simple usage, okay? Some 101 usage, if you like, of Tailwind utility classes. So what about something a little bit more interesting? So remember that panel that was on the left-hand side that was looking very sorry for itself, okay? We've just got this kind of Tailwind logo and it's not very interesting at all. So it would be cool if there was a gradient there, right? Let's put a gradient in. Gradients are one of them things that I would consider myself relatively proficient at CSS, but it's just one of those syntaxes I always have to Google, okay? I don't know why, but it never quite sticks in my head. So let's have a look what we can do to get this going in Tailwind. So with Tailwind, I can just add 3 classes. So I have BG gradient to BR, so that's a background gradient to bottom right. It's going to start at the top left, so it's going to go diagonally. And then I've got from green 400 to blue 500, starting color and end color, okay? So that's what I've added in, and now I've got a gradient, all right? And this is where the productivity element comes in. I dare anyone to type quick enough to go into a CSS file, create a class, add in the properties, come back, apply those to the HTML, hit save before I've done that. It's just not going to happen, okay? So this is one of the key points. These effects can be done very, very quickly with Tailwind. And we can even do some more funky stuff with this. So we can add in hover effects. So I can say, well, when we hover, okay, I want to go, in this time, when I hover, I want to go the inverse way around. I want to start from blue 500 and go to green 400. So if I swap back, and then I've got a hover effect. And again, this would be off into CSS. It would be creating a new pseudo class. It would be changing the hover effects. So You're just not going to do it as quick as what you can do with these utility classes. So that's pretty cool. Let's talk about another thing that can always be a bit of a pain, rotating and moving elements around, okay? So this kind of, bit of text at the bottom here is the survey prompt, okay? That you kind of normally get in the header in the default Blazor template. So let's start off by actually making this look a little bit more interesting first of all. So I'm just gonna replace the existing markup here with some styles, and we can see what that looks like. So now it looks a little bit more bold and in our face, and we can actually do something with it. But it's all very square. Everything on this page is very square. So what if I want to move this around, if I want to rotate the element slightly, okay? Rotating or transforming in CSS, again, it's a bit of a tricky syntax sometimes, depending on what you're doing. So how do we do this in Tailwind? Well, in Tailwind, it's 2 classes in this case, transform and rotate. So transform is going to say that I'm going to want to move this element about. That's what that class is going to allow us to do. And then I can say, in this case, rotate by 3. Now 3, again, maps to one of those spacing values in that design system. But the key part here, it's got a minus in front of it, which means it's going to go counterclockwise instead of clockwise, okay? So if we save that, go over, and then you can see that I've skewed the element slightly. So these things, which I definitely think are more of an intermediate level CSS stuff, certainly not something you'd be teaching beginners, feel quite trivial when you're doing them with Tailwind, okay? So at this point, there's a bit of an issue. There's usually a bit of an elephant in the room at this point, right? In that I've just styled my H1 and my P tag, which are pretty common elements in an application. You're going to see a lot of those with a load of styles. And obviously, people who are thinking about inline styles will be thinking, well, yeah, this is still inline styles though, Chris. Everywhere you've got an H1 tag, you've now got to copy those classes. Well, that's no different to having inline styles and a style tag. Fair point. So that's definitely one problem we need to deal with. How do you do this in Tailwind? How do you deal with this kind of replication of styles and styling base or common elements? There's also another problem here, okay? And that is something I haven't shown you yet, which is if we go back over to the app and we check out the other pages, that panel is on all of the pages, but it's not styled on those either, because again, that markup and the styles need to be copied over to every single one of them. So we've got 2 problems here. We've got styling of base elements and common elements, and we've got sort of dealing with repeated markup with repeated styles, okay? So they're the 2 primary problems, and usually the 2 things that most people who are new to Tailwind kind of have a problem with, and quite rightly so. So let's have a look at how we can deal with each of those. Now, the first one we're going to deal with is the styling of kind of base elements, common elements. So to do that, I'm going to go in that style app CSS file that we created earlier. So this is that input file. And inside of there, I'm going to add in a couple of classes, an H1 and a P tag, all right? Now, I said to you I wouldn't write any CSS, and technically I am right. I have not written any CSS properties out at this point. I have defined a class, admittedly, but I haven't written out any CSS properties. And that's because Tailwind allows us to use the apply directive when we're inside of this input file. That means that we can apply those same utility classes, but inside of this input file. So things like H1s, P tags, I don't know, anchor tags, those kind of things that you want to have common style across your application, you can define them here centrally. You can still get all of the benefits of using that design system and those utility classes, but you also get the ability of having them all centralized for maintainability. So if you all of a sudden decide that, your designer or you or whoever decides that headings need to be, a little bit bigger, you can just come in here and say, instead of 7XL, you want 8XL, or they need to be smaller, and you can go to 6XL. And you can do it in one place, and it will just affect your whole application. So if we save that and we go back over, if we go across the pages, you can now see that all those headings are now using those same styles, all right? So that's good. And if we go back over to our index page, I can now get rid of those ones that I put inside of here and get that back to what it was before, and everything still works. And if we go in here and have a look at the H1 tag, you can see that there's that H1 class that we defined, and you can see now that the properties have been translated from those utility classes into the regular CSS properties, so margin bottom, font size, font weight, etc. Okay? So that's one problem. That's how you deal with repeating styles of common elements. So the other one is repeated markup. So in this case, it's actually not Tailwind that's going to save us here, it's Blazor. So Blazor, like all of the other big front-end frameworks, uses a component-based architecture, and components are well-suited to solving this particular problem. They are pretty much designed to take repeated markup and put it into a central place and have it reused elsewhere. So in this case, what we can do is we can actually create a new component. So I'm going to do it inside of my shared folder here. I'm going to call this one Tailwind in capitals. And then inside of here, I'm just going to, oh, that's the wrong one. So this is that same markup that's on that home page, okay? The one that we just created with the background gradient and everything. So now I've got that defined as a reusable component. Oh, apologies, my typo. Good reminder that all Blazor components must start with a capital letter. So we'll get that running again. And then I can go over to my index page, and I can basically replace this markup now with a reference to my new component. So we can pop that in there. I can go over to my counter page, and we'll do the same thing. Replace that. And we'll do the same on the fetch data page, and we will replace that. There we go. So we get that running, go back over to our app, and you can see now that we've got that markup centralized, and we can now just put it wherever we want within the application, okay? So these are kind of the two big barriers that most people have when they try to adopt Tailwind. Most people get stuck with this idea that because it's utility-based, everything must always be in the markup, which generally, as a rule, that's where you should start. But certainly it's no different to any other type of coding. When you see the same thing repeated over and over again, you should find a way to abstract it and make it centralized and make it reusable. And these tools between the two frameworks allow you to do that. Cool. So now we've talked a bit about how we can deal with repetitive styles and a bit about maintenance and things like that. Let's do something that's a little bit more interesting now, because this has all been a bit kind of lightweight so far. So what we're going to do next is we're going to build a component that allows us to do animations. Now, animations are usually notoriously tricky, especially in Blazor, because it usually means dropping down to JavaScript, having some timers and whatever in JavaScript, and having it do stuff there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we can build a component using Tailwind's style classes, and we can do an animation effect without having to use any JavaScript at all. Okay, we can do this purely using C#. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to animate, if we go back to the home page, we're going to animate that panel. Okay, we're going to have it slide in from the right-hand side when the page first loads. All right, just to make this look a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to start off with a new component here. So we're going to call this one slide in, and then we're going to add in the initial markup. So if we just have a quick look through this, so the bits that are interesting here are that we're using something called templated components in Blazor. So a template component in Blazor just means a component that can wrap markup or that you can provide markup to that it will use somewhere in its markup, okay? So this is very good for building reusable things like grids are a good example, or modals or stuff, or in this case, an animation component. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna capture whatever we wrap, whatever markup we wrap inside of that parameter called child content. So in Blazor, when we have a parameter named child content with a type of render fragment, that basically means anything that's between the start and end tags will get captured there. So we can get a hold of that. And then we can output it wherever we want in our markup, which in this case is going to be in that div tag that we have that hasn't got any classes or anything on it at the moment. There's also our disposable on here because we are going to use a timer. Timers should be disposed. If you don't dispose them, you can get memory leaks and it can be bad. So we are being responsible here, even in a demo, and making sure we dispose of our timer correctly. Now, let's put in the initial styles here. So when this first renders, these styles are going to be applied by default. So hfull is just saying it's going to be the full height of whatever container it's in. That's by the by. But the next three are the interesting ones: transition, duration, and transform. Okay, and these are going to be the secret kind of sauce, if you like, for creating the animation effect. So transition is an interesting one. What this means is if we manipulate the value of a particular CSS property, okay, so we have a value of 0, and then we have a value of 100, and we change it between 0 and 100, sorry. Transition allows us to actually do that over a period of time. In this case, a duration of 500 milliseconds, so half a second. And transform, we saw that earlier, that's going to allow us to move the element around. And we said that we need to slide this off the page to the right-hand side so it's out of view. So that's what transform is there for. And then the final one there is the outputting of this private field animation style. So this is the thing that we're going to manipulate to create the sliding effect. So this is going to have some initial styles. So the initial style it's got is translate x full, which is going to push it 100% of its width off the side of the screen. All right, so that's going to get it out of the way when it first renders. And we're also going to set the opacity to 0. So this is going to just make it transparent. Okay, still going to take up space in the DOM and everything like that, but it's just going to be completely invisible. So that's what's going to get outputted into that div tag when the component first renders. So what happens next? Well, I'm just going to add in some code here onto the on initialized. So this is going to set up the timer. We're going to have the timer run for about 300 milliseconds, and then we're going to trigger, we're going to end up, when it elapses, we're going to call this trigger animation method, which we haven't added yet. So trigger animation is the thing that's going to then kind of make all this work. So what we're going to then do is, instead of having translate x full and opacity 0, we're going to swap over to translate x0 opacity 100. Now, the key point here is we're manipulating the same CSS properties under the hood, which is why transition and duration are going to work. So we're going to start with it all the way off the screen to the right, and then we're going to transition over 500 milliseconds for it to be back in its original position and to go from 0 to 100% opacity over that time. So it's going to slide and fade in one go. So the final sort of piece to the puzzle here is the on after render method, and that's we're going to wrap this call here in a first render check to make sure that it only happens once when the component first loads, and then we're going to start the timer, okay, and that's going to kick this animation off. So let's go and see if we can get this in action. So let's go to our index page. So we're going to wrap this Tailwind component. So I'm going to say slide in, and we'll cut that. Cool. And now we've got a sliding effect. Okay. So it's pretty quick, it's pretty rapid, but it's doing what we wanted it to, okay? So we can go away, if we come back, you can see that slide effect. Now, it's not perfect, okay? The eagle-eyed among you may notice if you look at the bottom of the screen, there is a slight problem here. If we go like that and come back, there is a scroll bar along the bottom, which isn't great. I mean, this is the browser being very helpful to us. It's going, oh, you've got something off the viewport. I'll give you a scroll bar so you can get over there. It doesn't understand what we're trying to do. But that's fine. We can fix this one. So I'm just going to go in the host page. And on the body here, I'm just going to pop in overflow x hidden, OK? So I'm going to do that because that will then stop that horizontal scroll bar being in place. So by combining these two technologies, we've now been able to write an animated component without using JavaScript, using C# and Tailwind classes, okay, and just swapping things back and forth. And admittedly, this is a pretty naive component, but hopefully from this you can see that there's potential here. You could easily make this component do more. You could have it slide in from different directions based on the value you passed in. You could have the duration be able to be configured through component parameters and things like this. You can even do things like bounce effects and swirl effects and all of this kind of stuff using some utility classes like spin and things that Tailwind provide as well. So things like loading spinners and all this kind of stuff, okay? So it's just to give you an idea really that this stuff is possible and is doable, and you haven't had to write any CSS in order to do it, or JavaScript in this case. So the last kind of major thing I'm going to talk to you about is dark mode. All right, dark mode is, I'm a fan of dark mode. I have dark mode everything, to be honest. This is light mode because it's just more readable when we're in a conference setting. But trust me, the second you all stand up from your seats, this is going back to dark mode, okay? It's like it burns my retinas and everything. So how do we do dark mode with Tailwind, all right? It's almost becoming a necessity nowadays to have an app be able to have dark mode and light mode. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to jump back over to my browser. I'm going to change my settings here. Yay, system default. Dark mode. Dark mode. Now, I'd love to stand here and go, isn't this amazing? Tailwind's just generated a dark mode for us because I changed my settings. But unfortunately, that's not the case, okay? I've actually gone through the app and I've applied some dark variants onto all of these elements, okay? But what this is showing you is that Tailwind actually supports dark mode out of the box. This used to be a setting you had to turn on, okay? With V2, you used to have to go into the configuration file and say you want to enable dark mode, and then it would generate a literal ton of utility classes in order for that to happen. It would bloat the file by about 5 meg. It was pretty big. But this is something now with the JIT compiler, it's pretty trivial. So it's turned on by default all the time. And by default, it uses system preference, okay, or browser preference, whichever you've got set, okay? So previously I had my browser set for light mode, hence that's what we were seeing. But now I've got my system default. We've got these dark mode settings applied. So how do we actually do sort of dark mode styling? Well, if we go over to our nav menu, this actually hasn't got any dark mode variants. That's why it's still white at the top. But we can fix that. So what we'll do is we'll replace the existing markup that's here with this one. So not a huge change, but if you look now, you can see that there are various classes that have the dark prefix on them, okay? So what happens here is whatever hasn't got the dark prefix will get applied when you're in light mode, and whenever dark mode is active, then the ones with the dark prefix get applied, okay? So the good example is on that header at the top, BG white by default, but when it's dark mode, it's BG gray 700. And that's basically what you do. You just go through your app and you have a light styles and you have dark styles, okay? So if we save that, go back over, you can see that the dark mode's been applied and we've now got that heading is now fitting in with everything else. So that's cool, okay? And we could just go, cool, all done here, but we can improve this, okay? At this point, this is only system preference, and this can be a bit of a pain. I mean, even a die-hard dark mode lover like me sometimes has days where I want to use light mode, all right? So wouldn't it be nice if there was like a toggle here so you could choose between the two and actually give the user that ability to decide what they want that day? Well, let's build that. That would be a good thing to build. So In this case, we do need to actually go back to our Tailwind configuration file because we do need to change something in here. So like I said, by default, dark mode is going to use whatever your system preference is, all right? So when we want to do it manually, we have to tell Tailwind that that's what we're going to do. So we have to change the dark mode option here to class, okay? So we go in the configuration bar, add dark mode, and then say that we're going to use class for that. So if I save that and we go back to the app, you can see all those dark mode styles have now been lost. We've got all of the light mode settings, okay? Now, the reason for that is because when we say that dark mode should use class, Tailwind is going to look for a class called dark somewhere in our HTML tree. And anywhere it finds that, any child elements of that will then have their dark variants applied, okay? So in order to make this work for our use case, what we actually want to do is on the HTML element, we want to apply dark there. And you can see once that dark class is added, all of our dark variants now come back into play, all right? So that is our task. We need to create a component that when we toggle between the two is going to remove or add that class to the HTML element. Now, the downside here is, unfortunately, I'm out of tricks. There is nothing I can do here to save you from JavaScript. In this case, we are going to need to do some JavaScript interop for this one. So let's go back over to Visual Studio and get started. So we'll start off by creating a new component. So we'll call that dark mode toggle. And this is what we're going to start off with, okay? So there's a bit of markup there. To be honest with you, the majority of it you don't need to care about. That's just things like styling stuff. But the secret sauce of this is a common trick in UI to make basic elements look a bit more interesting, which is a label with a for tag, and that maps to, and that's attached to this input down here, which is hidden. Okay, and what's going to happen is whenever I click on that label, that's actually going to affect that underlying input control. But the label we can style more effectively. So what you're going to see in a second is it will have a nice little round disk and it will slide back and forth between a light and a dark mode. On that input, that's where we're hooking in with our Blazor code. So we're going to set the initial value based on whatever that dark mode field is. But then we've got that on-change handler, and then that's going to invoke the toggle theme method. Okay, so every time we toggle between the two, we're going to get an opportunity to do something. So let's, before we go any further, let's just have a quick look at what that looks like. So if we go back to our nav menu, and we'll just add that in as a component. Cool. So up there in the top right, left, is that light dark mode. So that's what this thing looks like. All right, and what we're going to do is when we click on it, we're going to have it slide over to dark mode, and dark mode will become brighter, and light mode will fade, and blah blah blah. Everything will happen. So that's what it looks like. So let's actually try and get something working here. So the first thing, unfortunately, we will do to get this out of the way is to add in a bit of JavaScript. So in order to do this, I'm going to use a new feature that came out in .NET 6, okay, with Blazor, which is called co-located JavaScript. And it's a really good feature, and I'm a big fan of this. So with this, I'm going to call my JavaScript file dark mode toggle.razor.js. And then Visual Studio is going to nicely nest that for me in the Solution Explorer. So yeah, if we go over here, you can kind of see it's done this nice nesting effect, which is really useful and handy. I'm a big fan of this, particularly because I'm a big fan of vertical slice architecture and feature folders and all that kind of stuff. I really like the idea that stuff that is sort of related to each other lives together, or stuff that changes together lives together, however you want to say it. So this is a really good thing in my opinion. So once we've got that, we can create our JavaScript function. Now, Blazor, since .NET 5, has supported JavaScript modules, and this is a JavaScript module. I'm exporting this function, so I've got that export keyword at the front. And in this case, we're just going to take a string value of either light or dark, and then depending on what it is, it's going to either add or remove that dark class from the HTML element, all right? So nothing overly complex here. So now we've got that added, we can get rid of that. We don't need to worry about that anymore. However, we do need to use it inside of our Blazor component. So how can we load this JavaScript module? Well, we're going to import that, okay? I'm going to keep a reference to it using the IJS object reference type, okay? And this is the way in Blazor that we keep hold of a reference to something in JavaScript. So inside of the onAfterRender method, okay, on the first render, we're going to use the JS runtime, which has been injected at the top there, and we're going to go and we're going to load that JavaScript module. So to do that, we're going to use the import keyword. So this is a special function that Blazor provides us specifically for this scenario. And then the second argument we're passing in there is the path to that particular JavaScript module. Okay, so that's going to load that module up. Now, the nice thing about JavaScript modules and that in Blazor is that if you don't use this JavaScript file, if a user never goes to this page of your app, the JavaScript file will never get loaded. Okay, Blazor loads these files on demand when they're JavaScript modules. So if you do have any like heavy-hitting JavaScript that's only relevant to a certain bit of your app, then if you do it like this, then basically users aren't going to pay the cost of that download if they don't need to. So it's quite cool. The other thing is we don't have to put any reference to this JS file anywhere. We don't have to go in the index.html and add a reference to this script file or anything like that. It will just get picked up automatically. Cool. So now we've got that. Another thing I'm going to do here, just for completeness, is we're going to bring in the iasync enumerable, iasync disposable even, interface, because when we're using an IJS object reference, it does need to be disposed. Otherwise, we are going to get another memory leak. So popping that in there, and if the theme module is not null, then we're going to call its dispose method. Okay. So we've got those bits in there. So that's cool. So now we're going to update this toggle theme method. So inside of here, remember, this is going to get called every time we click on that toggle. We're going to set the value of that dark mode field based on whatever the value is that we're collecting from the change event args that get passed in. And then we're going to call into that set theme JavaScript function. And we're going to do that by using that theme module that we imported. And then we're just going to call invoke void async, set theme, and pass in whatever the value is. Okay? And that's going to pass that down and get that going. So let's save this off, come back over here, and see what we've got. Cool. So we've now got a working toggle. I can now switch over to dark mode, and we get that, and I can go back to light mode. All right? And if we open up developer tools, we look there, you can see that class is being added and removed from the markup every time we toggle back and forth. That's pretty successful. That wasn't too bad. There is a downside with this, though, and that is that if I toggle over to dark mode and I refresh the screen, it goes back to light mode again. Okay, there's no way for it to remember what my setting is. So this is not ideal. It would be far better if it could remember what we were doing. So what we can do here is we can save that value off into local storage instead, and then check for it when the application loads. And if there's a value there, we can load up whatever the user's setting was, and they can be happy that we remembered what they liked. So let's go and implement that. So at the top here, I'm injecting something called iLocal storage service. Okay, so this is something from one of my packages. This is Blazor local storage. It's probably easily the most popular local storage library for Blazor. I think it's like 2 million downloads or something at the moment. It gives you a C# interface into local storage APIs. All right, and it's going to handle serialization for you as well from C# types into JSON and backend and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so it's a nice, easy way to get access to local storage. So now we've done that, what we can do is in our toggle theme method, after we've called that set theme function, we can add in a call to local storage. Okay, and we can just say set the theme key equal to whatever the value of the theme is. Okay. So that's going to save it every time we change our preference. The last thing that we need to do is go and have a look for it when our component first loads. So after we've loaded in the module here in first render, we're going to then go into local storage and try and get the theme key. Okay? So if we can get the theme key, then we're going to take whatever that value is, and then we're going to call that set theme so we can set the initial value based on whatever the user had previously. So if we save that and we come back over, so you can see it's in light mode. If I go over to dark mode and I hit refresh, you can see it stays in dark mode now. Okay, and then we can have a look in the browser tools. If we go into application, there's that key down there, and it's changing back and forth as we toggle. Okay, So pretty successful. We've built our toggling component, and we've got it remembering the user settings and all of that good stuff. So that's great. So the last thing I just want to show you before I let you all go is how do you take all this now and move into production with it, okay? Because the whole time I've been doing this, I've been running the Tailwind CLI, okay? You can see here it's been doing rebuilds as we've been going along and adding new classes in and what have you. So what happens in a production scenario? Well, you've got two options here, okay? Because this is NPM, most CI systems are just going to allow you to put an NPM task in, and you can do that ahead of your build of your app and have it generate a file, and you can do it that way. But there is another option for you. So if you go into your CS proj file, you can actually have MS Build do a bit of this. So I can add in a couple of targets here. The first one is like, it doesn't matter a huge amount. It's just a sort of sanity check here to make sure NPM is installed on the build agent. Otherwise, it's going to fail the build. But the second one is the magic source. That's going to run that npx command inside of your build server. It's going to take the same input file. It's going to output the built file to the same place. The difference here is we're using --minify on the end, okay? So this is a nice feature of the Tailwind CLI. It's got minification built into it. So if we do that, and I now switch to release mode, and I do a build, and if I go over to my app CSS file, you can see now it's been minified, okay? So this is another reason why I like the CLI. It's really cool. It does this stuff, and you don't have to do any extra setup for it. So that's kind of the last piece of the puzzle, really, okay? We've gone from setting up our Blazor application with Tailwind, doing some development time stuff and building some cool components that do animation and dark mode and all that kind of stuff. And then we've just finished up by what we do to our CI pipeline to take this into a production scenario. So with that, that is about all I have got time for, I think, today. So thank you very much for watching. If you're interested in any of the code demos or the slides, you go to that URL, that'll take you to a GitHub repo. Other than that, thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference. And if you've got any questions, I'll be around. Feel free to give me a shout. Thank you very much.